as long as people live on dialysis. So keeping them off is pretty good.
So some basic question for Dr. Khullar, that how long a person will stay on dialysis, and also how long the fistula will also carry the burden of the daily or maybe weekly thrice pin up on their hand and then do the dialysis.
Yeah, well, I think I'm sure when Dr. Moskowitz says that 2 years is all that these patients mostly live for, I know that he will testify to the fact that the long-term survival of the kidney patients or the dialysis patients has vastly improved. Now, let me tell you, we used to look upon countries like Japan and some European countries, and to some extent US as well, um, uh, when it came to the long-term survival. And we in our country used to wonder as to how people are surviving on dialysis for periods as long as 20 years, 30 years. And in fact, recently we came across a person who in Japan has been on dialysis for good 46 years using the same AV fistula, right? But now, fortunately for us in India as well, the survival while on dialysis has significantly improved. The quality of dialysis, luckily in our country, has immensely improved, whereby we have started looking at people who have survived on dialysis for periods as long as 20 years, longer than that, and some centers would say even 30 years. So obviously, 2 years or 5 years is not what we are typically looking at. Agreed that diabetics do not tend to survive for very long, even while on dialysis. But then I think, as a nephrologist, you get disappointed when you lose someone while on dialysis for just about, I would say, 10, 15 years. So our mindset has changed from anywhere between 1 or 2 years, which we would used to believe about 2 or 3 decades ago, that it's okay, it's some achievement. And now, as I said, even 10, 15 years doesn't appear to satisfy us. Now, answering your question, well, you look at it from this angle. If you do not subject your patients to dialysis when they actually need it, they're going to die. So we often we find people criticizing dialysis to quite an extent. But the fact of the matter is, look back before 50s and 60s, none of them would have survived. And now we are talking about 30, 25, 20 years of survival on dialysis. So one thing is very clear, they would not survive without dialysis. Now, dialysis gives them a new lease of life, has some problems associated. It may be cumbersome. Patient has to go to the hospital 2 to 3 times in a week, get those lines. But at the end of the day, and a lot of expenditure involved, and especially in countries like ours, whereby so many times patients pay from out of their own pockets. So it becomes quite a challenge how to sustain a long-term dialysis. But on a positive note, you are able to save so many precious lives. Now, this is about typically the dialysis, but this is not the only treatment for these patients. The preferred modality of treatment, wherever possible, is always kidney transplant for these patients. If they can manage it, I think by all means we advocate kidney transplant to these patients. But before that, my question again to David. You see, I am quite thoroughly impressed with your opinion about ACE inhibitors, especially quinapril. But my question to you would be, don't you think we have had ACE inhibitors and receptor blockers for long enough period of time? If I remember correctly, captopril was made available to us almost like 30 years ago. And in the new millennium, there has been a lot of optimism with which we have looked at RAS blockade, be it ACE inhibitors like quinapril or receptor blockers like the various sartans. Now, if what you say, and I have no reason not to believe that, don't you think with so much of usage of ACE inhibitors over the last at least 20 years, we would have reached a stage whereby it was possible to stall dialysis by many, many years? I accept the fact that we have been able to delay the onset of dialysis, but to put a full stop to the kidney disease is something which I would really want to know from you.
Right. Well, this gets to the political nature of research rather than research itself. So, the expression that's gotten famous nowadays in popular culture is "don't go there." So like a woman who is angry beyond belief, she'll just put up her hand and say, "Don't go there." Basically, that's what the nephrology profession has done to high-dose quinapril. I was told to submit grants to the NIDDK, which is chaired by a classmate of mine from medical school, and the whole NIDDK Institute is directed by my residency, my resident, who was a year or two ahead of me at WashU. So I know the people involved, but and some people they involve in a pre-study meeting for a couple of years. They help them, bang out the details of the study. When it comes to clinical research for preventing dialysis, there's no money involved. E.J. Lewis told me that. And there's no appetite for it. And why should there be when Medicare itself, which is shelling out $35 billion a year of taxpayers' money, has tens of thousands of salaries that depend on the practice. So Sinclair Lewis, who was one of our muckraking journalists from 100 years ago, said, "Don't expect to convince somebody whose salary depends on ignoring what you're telling him." And that's actually what's happened with this high-dose quinapril. It turns out there is no upper limit to the amount of quinapril that you can use. So for fibrillary GN, which is an essentially untreatable disease, in a 260-pound, 300, somewhere around 260, 280, I used 160 BID of quinapril, so more than 1 milligram per pound. And his creatinine finally came down. So there doesn't seem to be an upper limit, and anybody who is progressing for any reason, I would just keep going up on their quinapril, knowing that I can control their potassium with Florinef and then with Lasix.
So that's exactly what I was going to come to. You see, and for the others, for the sake of the others, as David was saying, it's a very great class of antihypertensives, the quinapril and the related ACE inhibitors. They have made a big difference. Agreed. But you see, one of the main problems with this class of drugs is the risk of high potassium. And there are two problems here. One, the drug itself is causing a tendency to cause high potassium in the blood. And secondly, the kidney function is deteriorating. And the kidney is the seat of excretion of potassium from the body. So with the advancing renal failure, the kidney's capacity to get rid of potassium goes low. So there is, on one hand, as such, higher chances of having high potassium in the blood, and on the other hand, you are giving a drug, which of course you are giving because of the positive effects, which is going to give to the patient, but has a very important side effect, and that is high potassium. Now, what we also have tried a lot of high dose of not necessarily quinapril, but maybe ramipril or some other drugs which were made available to us for last so many years now. But one of the limiting factors always was the high potassium. And I remember when you said that you're combining it with the Florinef, fludrocortisone, which gets rid of the potassium. But mind you, there are going to be problems now of fludrocortisone, because that causes sodium retention. So you are now hopefully not falling in a trap whereby you set about taking care of one particular aspect, and then in the bargain you are in going circles, taking care of one side effect after the other. But anyway, if you are able to demonstrate that yes, a supranormal high dose, well, I will accept the fact that we also have been using very, very high doses. I mean, even more than what were actually allowed to be used. But as I said, the limiting factor always is potassium. And for the viewers, again, the reason why we dread high potassium is because it can be a sudden killer. It can suddenly stop the heart without much of warning, because that's why we are terribly scared of high potassium. The normal value is less than 5 or 5.2, and the moment it crosses 5.5, it starts giving us some kind of jitters, and obviously we can't tolerate something more than 6. So I will need your comments as to how have you been able to manage your potassium and manage the side effects of fludrocortisone, and yet able to bring down the serum creatinine from the verge of requiring dialysis. You bring the patient back from stage 5 to stage 4, etc.
Well, Dr. Khullar, you're touching on many of the reasons why I'm still the only person using high-dose quinapril. I tried high-dose ramipril, but it didn't work, and so I wound up just using what was on formulary, which was quinapril, and to my delight, it did work. Turns out potassium can go up to 7. We used to have to dialyze people for 6, for a potassium of 6. I remember getting called into an emergency room in my tuxedo after a National Kidney Foundation gala to dialyze somebody who had a potassium of 6 or something. It turns out chronically elevated potassiums can be quite high, and we get nervous about things that aren't necessarily worth freaking out about. And in terms of my previous comments about how hard the system is to predict, and to Kim, it turns out that if you give Florinef less than daily, if you give it 5 days a week, you get potassium lowering, a chaliuretic effect, without sodium retention and fluid retention. And the minute you go to daily, then you get the sodium and fluid retention too, and congestive heart failure, and you have to use Lasix. And I found that out with my first patient. I didn't know any better. I used Florinef every day because that was the dose for orthostatic hypotension. And he came back a month later in florid congestive heart failure with a good potassium, but he couldn't breathe for the last 2 weeks of the month. So that's what taught me that maybe less than daily works, and it does. And now what I've done for very tough cases is I hate using Lasix because it activates the renin-angiotensin system, which seems to be the whole goal of the exercise, is to suppress it. And so now what I do is instead of 0.1 milligrams of Florinef Monday through Friday, I go, which is 5.5 a week, I go up to 0.8 a week, 0.2 Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. So there's 4 days on Florinef, with gaps in between. And that doesn't cause fluid retention.
So that's really amazing and very interesting, you see, because if that's the correct way of using these drugs, then I think you are going to make a big difference, you see, because these weapons have been there, and maybe we were probably not knowing how to best use them. And if looking at the kind of enormity of the task ahead, if any drug, and with the correct way of using it, and along with combining it with the drugs which mitigate each other's side effects, I think that's going to be a great thing. Obviously, for my country, you see, where we will struggle to afford the cost of dialysis on too many patients, because as the numbers increase over the period of years, I think we are going to be in trouble for sure. So yes, any such strategy which you are wanting to promote is going to mean a lot, at least to my country.
Well,
I think it's interesting too. I just want to butt in because fluid retention is a huge problem with any and all of this when you're talking with diabetes. Is there a way that people can proactively address this situation by maybe drinking more fluids, or maybe even have fluids add to their diet to help flush their body out? Is it because their body's not flushing out the fluids fast enough and they retain the fluids? Because, you know,
Yeah, that's something which I think common sense would say that yes, the function of the kidney